You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast, and I have Dr. Jeffrey A.Morgan. He's a cardiac surgeon, performs bypass surgery, mitral and aortic valve surgery, and installation of heart pumps called LVADs, and heart transplants. He's also the Chief Medical Officer for BIOLIFE4D. So, Dr. Morgan, thanks for coming. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so tell me about your work with the heart. First of all, why do you decide to have you decided to focus on the heart, and what are some of the things that you do?
Sure. So I'd say from the first year of medical school, I wanted to become a heart doctor and got interested in the heart and in particular heart failure. I went to go see a heart surgery during my first summer of medical school and was just really sold on the concept of repairing heart valves and doing bypass surgery, and for patients with advanced heart failure, doing heart transplantations. It's really a great field, and I feel very fortunate each day to go to work and be able to take care of patients and make a difference in their lives.
That's great. So what are some of the novel or interesting things that you're working on recently?
Well, some of the things I've been working on recently are relating to replacements for the heart, so left ventricular assist devices, so-called LVADs, and alternatives to heart transplantation. What an LVAD is, it's a pump basically that goes into the heart to help a failing heart. Patients with advanced heart failure whose hearts are just simply not working well, and they have trouble with maintaining their daily lives. They just can't do the activities they once were able to do. They get very short of breath. They can't sleep at night. They get fatigued. They don't have any energy, and they often get admitted to the hospital with heart failure. The point of these pumps is to keep them out of the hospital, is to be able to establish normal or close to normal amount of blood flow to the rest of their body, to their other organs, to get them back to the lifestyle that they once had before they developed heart failure. The work I do with BIOLIFE4D is really, really exciting. I was working on bioprinting a heart, which would take the place of heart transplantation. Heart transplantation in many ways is really trading one disease for another. You basically remove the heart that's not working, you put in a new heart, but patients have all sorts of other problems relating to heart transplants and being on anti-rejection medications. They have a high incidence of infection because their immune system is shut down. They have rejection, and the heart only lasts about 8 to 10 years, and so it's really not a great solution for the problem.
Why does the heart only last 8 to 10 years?
Well, the issue is that you're putting a heart from another human being into someone, and so there are compatibility issues. Despite us trying to match them as well as we can based on blood type, size, and other factors, it's not a perfect match, and so the body rejects it. And chronic rejection is one of the main causes for the arteries of the heart becoming blocked over time, and that leads to the heart not working, and eventually, most patients get about 10 years, sometimes longer, from heart transplantation, but it really just can't meet the needs of the population. And even if we had, even if we had better results with heart transplants, the problem is we only can do a little over 2,000 when about 200,000 people need heart transplants. So it just really doesn't answer the demand or the need.
What about artificial hearts? Have any been made that work for any length of time? What are those like?
Yeah, so the artificial hearts, there's one FDA-approved artificial heart called Syncardia, and it is a good therapy for patients who need it. It's the only approved therapy, but it has a lot of problems associated with it. After all, it's a machine, and there are blood clots that form in the pump. It also gets infected because it's a good piece of hardware in the heart. It also has a certain instance of device malfunction where it just, simply doesn't work well. So it's not the answer for people. Right now, it's the only answer, but we really need to do better. And there are certain technologies and new therapies that are being considered and are being developed, and hopefully just a few years away.
So are you attempting to recreate the entire heart, or just certain functions of it? Maybe like an organoid type thing, or just part of the heart, or one chamber? Or...
Yeah, we're attempting to recreate the entire heart. What BIOLIFE4D is trying to do, our goal that is to be able to bioprint an entire heart. Along the way, there are going to be some victories of bioprinting just a valve, like a mitral valve or an aortic valve, or maybe even the aorta, or maybe even the coronary arteries, to help isolated patients who have those types of isolated problems with a valve or a coronary artery. But the long-term goal is to be able to bioprint an entire heart, and to be able to basically do what heart transplantation does today, is to replace someone's heart.
When people have heart failure, what are the most common mechanisms of heart failure? What is failing? Is it, the valves? Is it the cardiac muscle dying? I mean, have we identified like a Pareto of, if you only could make part of a heart, what would be the most useful for a start?
Yeah, usually it's a muscle problem. It's the fact that the heart pump is not working well. It can be due initially to a valve problem, or it can be due initially to blockages in the arteries that initially cause the problem. But ultimately, the final road is the same, and that is that the heart is not pumping effectively. Its pumping function has been significantly reduced. The blood backs up in the lungs. And these patients are just absolutely miserable. They have a very, very challenging life. They feel terrible, and their mortality is very, very high. So patients with advanced heart failure have a 1-year mortality of about 90%, which is just, really, really unfortunate. So basically all of these patients, unfortunately, are dead at about 1.5 years, 2 years. So we really, really need to do better. I think as a field, we need to be able to provide these patients with a better therapy, a heart replacement therapy that's better than what we can do today. Today, the options are really only the Syncardia and heart transplant. And each of those is really fraught with many downsides.
Would it be easier to try to emulate some of the functionality of the heart, or is it easier for some reason to just do an entirely new one, to grow one from scratch and make an entire heart?
Yeah, what the LVAD does is it tries to emulate the left ventricle, and it helps, it serves as a left ventricle, but, sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes the right side of the heart has a problem with it too. And when the right side of the heart has a problem with it, the only other therapy that's going to work is a totally implantable heart or a heart transplant. So, a lot of times it just depends on what's going on with the right side of the heart. The valves we can address. It's an issue of really the right side of the heart, which we can't address other than with an implantable total artificial heart.
So what are some of the mechanisms of rejection? So you have to put the person on immunosuppressive drugs, even if you did successfully, create a new one from scratch. But actually, would you, if you're able to create one from scratch? Is there any matching that we could do with a brand new printed heart that couldn't be done with a transplant?
Yeah, the advantages of a bioprinted heart are numerous. To be able to take one and have it right away and have it created from the patient's own cells would just be a huge step forward. First of all, in terms of availability, it would drastically improve things. So right now, patients, when they get on the heart transplant list, some programs, you can be waiting a year and a half to get a heart transplant. And that's just, too long for many people. A lot of people die waiting on the heart transplant list. So to be able to recreate one using a patient's own cells and give it to them right away, that's, in and of itself, a huge advantage. The other major advantage of a bioprinted heart would be the rejection issue. Because it's a patient's own cells and tissue, they wouldn't reject it. And so they would need to be on the anti-rejection medications, which would mean that they wouldn't be immunosuppressed. They wouldn't have this very, very high incidence of infections like we see now with transplant patients. And because they don't have the rejection, they wouldn't have the coronary artery disease that develops so rapidly in patients with heart transplants because of the rejection. So, there would be many benefits, but it's a big project. It's a tall order, and this is a field that is really just getting started, or just in the last few years, with the goal of being able to bio-create organs. And our goal is to create a new heart, which would really help potentially hundreds of thousands of patients per year by taking these folks with end-stage heart failure who right now don't really have a good answer. Transplant can't really meet the needs of the population, and the mechanical heart, the syncardia, is fraught with all sorts of mechanical and structural and long-term problems. So there would be a huge clinical benefit, if we were in fact successful in being able to develop the artificial heart that we have in mind. But it's going to be a staged development with, first the development of, like I mentioned, valves. We're also working on a mini heart, which might have other applications for testing of different drugs in a, sort of a heart environment, to look at the cardiac effects of different drugs, but, would really represent a major leap forward and victory if in fact we can develop that. But this is really a long-term project, and we have our eye on the prize, on the goal, so to speak, which is to really bioprint a full heart.
I don't know if this is ridiculous, but I know with kidney transplants, they'll leave the kidneys in the person and just add one. Would it be possible to have two segments of, a transplant heart, one that's, upstream of the current, left side, one that's downstream, the right side, or vice versa, and leave the existing heart in place and just add these two halves of a heart upstream and downstream of it? Would that have any benefit?
That's a great question. There is such a concept actually in heart transplantation, just as you're describing, exactly like that, which is called a heterotopic heart transplant. It's very, very rarely done today. The vast majority of heart transplants are what we call orthotopic heart transplant, which is where we take out the heart and replace it. But what you're describing has been done. it's generally reserved for a very, very small percentage of cases, because there are benefits in doing it in an orthotopic fashion, in replacing the heart, taking it out, and putting the new one in that particular location.
Well, maybe not even a whole half of the heart, but just to get boost. Either, I don't know, like wireless routers have boosters. I mean, would there be is there a pump booster that could be put in a given artery to assist the heart? Or when the heart's ejecting, the oxygenated blood, is there a way to boost it and assist it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's what sort of these LVADs are, is that it boosts one part of the heart, the left ventricle. It, the blood is essentially rerouted, instead of going from the left atrium to the left ventricle and out to the aorta and relying on the pump function of the heart. This plugs into the left ventricle, takes a lot of that blood, sends it through the pump instead, and the pump kind of boosts it out, or sends it out, if you will, to the aorta through a graft. So, we do sort of use that mechanism now with these LVADs to, we don't actually replace any part of the heart. We leave the heart in place, and we connect this machine or pump. But the problem is that LVADs have a downside. As good as they are, and they help many, many people each year, the problem is that it has a power cord that goes through the skin, and it needs to be connected to batteries. The battery pack needs to be changed every 6 hours or so. Patients are constantly reminded about the need to recharge and the fact that they're dependent on a machine. We don't have a fully implantable LVAD right now. There are companies that are working on that with wireless rechargeable technology that can charge it through the skin, but we don't have that right now. But yeah, I mean, the question is, a very good one is, can we leave in, or can we create this booster? And right now the closest thing that we have to that is an LVAD. Although again, the LVAD really, hasn't been the full answer for these patients, just because of the adverse event profile or complications that are associated with it.
Is there any way to do like a dialysis for the heart? Let's say you put in a transplant that lasts 8 to 10 years, but maybe part of the mechanism for failure is that fibrous growths obscure the vessels and clog up the heart. Is there a way, once a month, let's say, for a patient to go and have their blood circulated through a machine and cleaned in such a way that it would extend the life of that heart somehow?
I'll tell you, for the kidneys that works, because, if you think about it, the kidneys, their main purpose is to really filter the blood, take out the bad stuff. And you can do that, you can simulate that by putting someone on dialysis. The heart's different in that it's a pump, and, once that pump stops working, you really need to either change the pump out, or put a booster in, so-called LVAD. Now, one thing we do kind of do is there are certain medications that patients will sometimes come in for, inotropes, as we call them, which help the heart's function. And some of those can last 2 weeks or so. So patients could come in for certain inotropic therapies, like milrinone, for example, have that run for a few hours into the intravenous portion, leave the hospital, and that might be good for a couple of weeks, because the half-life of milrinone, it can take a while until it exits the system. But those types of therapies are not really conventional at this point.
So would it be useful to further or better understand the mechanisms of rejection, with heart transplants? Even if you're able to build a heart from the person's own cells, would there still be any rejection? And I don't know, is there any learnings from there?
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned there for sure, in terms of the mechanisms for rejection. And, a lot of science and research has been done around this area. And what it really seems to be at this point is incompatibility issues. And, there have been a lot of different attempts at making hearts and other organs more compatible between the donor and the recipient, looking at different factors in the blood that perhaps could be used to create compatibility. But with such a limited donor supply, it becomes an issue of risk-reward ratio. And, when you have a patient who is otherwise going to die without this heart transplant, even though there's some compatibility issues on a relatively minor level, in the short term, it's going to really benefit the patient, and it's going to give them 5, 10, 12 years. But the chronic rejection is really what ultimately leads to the failure of the organ. But, going back to your question, absolutely. More work needs to be done in the field in terms of understanding rejection, what we can do differently. Are there medications? There haven't been any major breakthroughs in immunosuppression medications in years. Cyclosporin was a big breakthrough. There have been, some other medications that have really come along and helped. But overall, if you look at the survival for heart transplant, it hasn't really changed very much over the last few decades. It really has remained around median survival of around 10 to 12 years. So we are in need of more research to understand rejection and better treatments for preventing rejection.
Yeah, well, I haven't asked you, what are the difficulties in creating a whole heart de novo? Is it the connective tissue? Is it, what is it about creating a heart that's difficult?
Yeah, so, this field is really just starting. The whole bioprinting field of bioprinting organs is a very young field, and it's likely going to really have significant milestones, accomplishments, and evolve quite a bit in the next, 10, 15, 20 years. But, the challenges are creating 4 chambers, creating 4 valves, creating a automated pumping mechanism, creating electrical synchronization like we have now with the sinoatrial node and the conduction fibers and the bundle of His and how it spreads to the different ventricles and how there's coordinated synchronized contraction, how the impulse propagates through the different parts of the heart, and connecting the major vessels, the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the inflow from the venous system. So there are a lot of complex structural, anatomical, physiological barriers and challenges that need to be worked out. And now that's not to say they can't be overcome, but it takes a team of people and a multidisciplinary team of people that can work together and be able to address a lot of these different individual challenges.
This may be a stupid question, but does the heart have to have 4 chambers? Can it only have 2 or 3? And are there other organisms that, the way their heart functions, maybe it's less complicated morphologically, but it still would work for a person?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. The issue is that one of the sides of the heart pumps to the lungs, the other side of the heart pumps to the body, the systemic body, so all the organ systems. And each of those sides, so to speak, has both a pumping chamber and a reservoir chamber, if you will. So each one has an atria and a ventricle. And so you definitely need those 2 different sides, one pumping so-called blue blood or deoxygenated blood that goes to the lungs to get oxygenated, and one that pumps the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And, you really, need sort of 2 different chambers for each of those functions. So a reservoir one and a pumping one. And you also don't want blood regurgitating across one chamber to the other. You want it to be very intentional. And so that, creates a system where you need 4 chambers and 4 valves. And so it gets kind of complicated. And again, just a lot of challenges that we're just really beginning to understand now. And, I think that's really the first step in being able to overcome those challenges and hopefully be able to bioprint a heart that, achieves our goals.
So what has been accomplished so far? What has been printed, and has anything been printed that's been implanted that's worked from the person's own cells?
Yeah, so BIOLIFE4D has been able to bioprint cardiac patches, which has been a real breakthrough. The ability to print cells and to have these patches being made has been a real breakthrough. Also, we're pretty close to the mini heart, which will be a real breakthrough. And simultaneously, BIOLIFE4D is working on being able to print valves and being able to print blood vessels. And so, there are many projects that are going on all at the same time because in order to bioprint a full heart, I think we're going to need to be able to achieve a lot of individual goals along the way. So we'll be able to need to print a mitral valve, an aortic valve, a left coronary artery, a right coronary artery, the whole coronary tree. There are going to need to be a lot of milestones and individual printing in order to really make the heart come together as a unit.
Why would a mini heart have any success? What's different about it besides being small?
Well, the issue for a mini heart, one of the advantages or one of the useful mechanisms for the mini heart is going to be actually testing drugs and to look at cardiac toxicity and cardiac physiology. And what I mean by that is right now, pharmaceutical companies spend an enormous amount of money doing clinical trials, and before the clinical trials, animal trials and experiments looking at side effects or even the primary effects of a drug on the heart. If we can create an environment for a biopharmaceutical company to be able to test the drug without going through the very expensive animal studies, that would be very, very beneficial, not just from a financial point of view, but also expediting drugs through the pipeline. And also to be able to more accurately simulate cardiac conditions with this type of mini heart. And basically what it does is it enables the pharmaceutical company to really see exactly what happens to the heart with this drug, rather than really needing to sacrifice an animal, the cost and, the ethical issues associated with that. To be able to directly simulate cardiac conditions, the BioHeart would be advantageous. And also just in terms of, taking us closer to the next step of being able to actually bioprint a full heart. If we can do a mini heart, that would represent a significant milestone.
If you look at embryological development, what happens to the heart? Does it start out as like a little mini heart and just grow bigger and grow radially or circumferentially outward? Or does it morphologically look different as it develops?
It's more of the latter. It morphologically looks different. There are different parts of the heart that get formed at different periods of time. So, for example, the septum, the ventricular septum between the two ventricles, or the atrial septum, or the actual valve itself, or the conduction tissue, all these happen at different time periods. So, the heart is built, sort of over time.
I just didn't know if that would give any clues on how to create one from scratch. If you follow the embryological development pathway, or if we're following different pathways that would work better or worse.
Yeah, it's interesting. We haven't really thought about coordinating the embryology and the sequence from embryology to the actual bioprinted heart, but I wonder if that's something that we should think about.
I guess there's a reason for it, so maybe something to at least look at,
That's right. Yeah. Something to think about for sure.
Well, very good. Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. What do you project may happen in the next 5 years, and then maybe in the next 15 or 20?
Well, I hope that in the next 5 years, we'll have a bioprinted heart. I hope that we'll be able to work out all the challenges, and 5 years from now, when we have a patient with heart failure, we'll be able to actually bioprint a heart. We'll be able to take cells and formulate chambers and really produce a heart and just be able to put it into patients who need heart transplants. I think it's going to become more and more sophisticated over time. I think the overall expected function and longevity of the bioprinted organ is going to increase over time. Again, it's a very exciting field. I think there are a lot of unknowns right now, and we're just happy to be part of that process.
Well, very good. Well, Dr. Morgan, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been super interesting.
No, thank you so much. Really, this has been great, and it's been a great opportunity. Thanks a lot.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.